How's it going, everyone? Pat Parnell here for the Coast Film Festival, and honored to be joined by none other than Director of Gather, Sanjay Rawal. Sanjay, thank you so much for making some time. Yeah,
Great to be here, Pat. Thanks so much for having me.
yeah. Um, First and foremost, I want to say how much I enjoyed the film. It surrounds itself about rebuilding native foods, but it's really interesting, kind of some of the paths it takes you on. I want to get into what was the impetus of this, and did you realize you were going to have so many kind of tentacles, kind of drag you in different directions and different stories?
Well, my first film was called Food Chains, and it was about a small group of farm workers in southern Florida, and Eva Longoria was a producer. These farm workers are seen as Latino, but in fact, they're from indigenous communities in Oaxaca, Chiapas, Guatemala. Just like a lot of California farm workers are actually displaced indigenous southern Mexican, northern Guatemalans. My second film, 3100 Run and Become, really looked at Native American running and looked at traditional running practices in the Kalahari Desert. Um, but the idea of doing a film on Native American food sovereignty, I felt was outside the realm of permissibility, so to speak.
Hmm.
I mean, the very first documentary film in 1929 was called Nanook of the North, and it was by an Anglo-American filmmaker, Robert Flaherty. It was a deep dive into a character, an Inuit hunter in Alaska. It was a great movie done with a lot of participation with the community, but it set forth an industry where a lot of us, fly to exotic locations, bomb in, film locals, and get the heck out. And after a hundred years of that, indigenous communities, particularly those in North America, kids tend to learn about their culture through media created by non-natives. So with a film that was supposed to be wide in scope, like make a film about Native American food systems, I wouldn't have dared if I didn't have a whole team of native producers and executive producers. And it was really those executive producers at an organization called First Nations Development Institute that helped me find the characters. They had the track record of working with these characters over decades. And so I could fly in and immediately have the sort of trust that would take an outsider 10, 20 years to really develop.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine. I mean, when you take the experience up at Klamath and in Northern California compared to the Apache experience, and then the whole foraging story, and I love how those kind of intertwined. How much just on the pre-production level did you have to go and kind of play those stories out and make sure that they were valid for a movie like this?
That's a great question. So, since I would imagine most of the audience for the fest is in California, we filmed a lot up north of Eureka on the Klamath River on the border of Oregon and California. And our crew came from all over the states, but we'd all have to fly into San Francisco and drive 7 hours. So, the actual cost of getting people to locations, I mean, even the Apache reservations are on the border of Arizona and New Mexico, a half a day's drive really from any major airport. To get people to locations, was a major expense. And so we wanted to really economize our shooting schedule. So we spent 6 months, just me and my producer, flying around to various Native communities and trying to find ways to build a story that wasn't academic, as most people saw in the movie. We're not trying to like educate anybody about the history of natives in North America, but we were trying to create an emotional story. And so when you meet characters that are cinematic, that can hold the frame of a movie, even if they're not speaking, we knew that we had something. So number one, we had a selection of characters that we knew were authentic. Their work was great. And number two, we would just go and hang out with them and imagine what it would be like to have a camera in those scenarios. So it was a lot of pre-production, but at the end of the day, we wanted to make sure our characters were our experts. And so we picked people that were authentic and just kind of magnificent in how they interacted with nature.
Yeah, we'll call it accidentally academic, because I definitely learned a lot as I watched it. What are some surprising takeaways that you learned through the whole experience, whether it be in terms of like the food source, or some of the battles that so many Native Americans still face to this day? Or is what's the biggest takeaway for you?
So as I can speak pretty honestly as a non-native, and as someone who grew up in California myself, that at some point we were all indigenous to somewhere. And if you think about human populations, except for very small pockets of really oppressed people like the Ashkenazi Jews, most people's ancestors stayed in a particular place for 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 generations. You take a human being, you put them anywhere in the world, you either give them a jacket and you give them water, and they can survive for a few hours or a few days, no problem. But if you can't digest the food in those locations, you're dead. So, like if you're born north of the Arctic Circle and your liver can't process a lot of fat, you don't pass on your genes. So, our genetic interactions were shaped by generations of foods. If your body wasn't adapted to specific foods in your environment, you didn't pass on your genes. So, looking at today, seeing that most of us are an amalgamation of different cultures, we can accurately say that pretty much none of us are eating the types of foods that our genes are made for. We don't even know what those are. So our American food system is as far away from the type of food system that created this incredible genetic strength within us. So just as a long way to get to it, I went and asked my parents, who are from India, different parts. I said, can you remember what was in the pantry of your grandparents or your great grandparents? And when they began listing those ingredients and listing preparations, it was a completely different set of food than I would associate with modern Indian cuisine. And I think we can all do that. And I think we can go back into our family histories and put together foods or types of techniques, fermentation, etc., that'll give us a much clearer sense of the types of things that give us proper strength and proper diet. So from that standpoint, this revitalization in Indian country, of foods, as you saw in the movie, it's not just about food, it's about identity. And I think each individual who watches this film can begin to ask those questions looking back at their own ancestry.
I want to ask you, as an artist and as a filmmaker, what is it about these types of stories that you're drawn to? You could go a lot of directions as a filmmaker, but there seems to be a connectivity in some synergy with the things that and the stories that you've gone after.
Looking back, and I had no plan to do this, but the three movies I've made across the last decade really have to do with Mother Earth. The first one, Food Chains, looked at farm workers, but looked at the importance of human beings in bringing food out of the ground to your table, and often marginalized human beings. The second movie was about ultra distance running, but from the indigenous perspective, our Navajo character said, when you run, your feet are praying to Mother Earth. You're breathing in Father Sky. You're asking them for their blessings. You're showing them that you're willing to work for those blessings. And it looks back at a point that in human history that we all have some connection to, where we actually prayed with our feet. We had a connection to earth, not just through food, water, and air, but through the feeling of our feet on the ground and how we moved in space and how we imbibed different energies of nature. And this third film is kind of a synthesis of both. It's the importance of energy in place, and it's the importance of pulling energy out in the form of food into one's body. And I didn't plan this trajectory. It just is headed that way. But, I had a great crew. My cinematographer was Renan Ozturk, whom the mountain climbers in the audience will remember from the award-winning film Meru. He's a North Face climber.
Yeah.
He's a Nat Geo photographer. So from an artistic standpoint, when we were trying to figure out what to do with this film, we understood that our characters knew so much more about this topic than we ever could imagine, and that we wouldn't be able to get all the information held in their hearts out of them verbally. So we wanted to create situations where we could just film them doing their thing, and people at various levels of understanding would get something deeper. Like for me, as a non-native, I'm fascinated by the most basic things. But as someone who's a native forager, for example, they could identify with Twyla's techniques. They could identify with the implements, like the sticks that she shaped to go hunting for that pack rat. So we tried to capture as much visually as we could, and kind of just leave the level of understanding and receptivity up to the audience member.
Yeah, and I love too how you touched on early, especially telling the plight of Native Americans, and how they went after the food source, how they went after the bison. You take away the food source, you take away, you take away their ability to survive and endure. It's
Yeah.
really telling. Uh, Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was no. I'd let you expand on that, because it kind of that strings all the way through, and it was just it's a story that a lot of people surprisingly don't know about the history, and it wasn't that all that long ago. That's the shocking part about it.
Yeah, so it's interesting, the different approaches to colonization. Obviously, the United States really started as a colony of with British descendants. And when those first British descendants first came, they came to establish farming. And they didn't come to wilderness. They came to the East Coast was a whole series of Native American farms. But rather than practicing kind of a regenerative farming practice, they were trying to extract as much wealth from the soil as quickly as possible. They were trying to grow tobacco. They were trying to grow cotton, things that they could ship overseas for a maximum amount of money. And that required enslaving people in Africa and kind of creating economics that we still see today in the food system. That said, when they were growing food for themselves, they were doing things the way Europeans did, particularly Anglo Europeans. And there wasn't necessarily a sense of the 10,000 years of agriculture that already existed in the United States. Interestingly enough, the French were totally different. The French had relationships with natives that was much less adversarial and much more partnership based. But that said, as the kind of British model, that American model, moved westward, they planted corn. They planted, even though those were Native American products, they planted wheat, but massive fields. They grazed cattle. They did everything wrong that you possibly could do, and nobody knew it then. But like 100 years later, you go like, why is there a crisis, a food crisis, a water crisis? It's because in the last 100 years, we did things in the exact opposite way than the whole set of ecosystems had evolved over 10,000 years, which is why now you see a push to regenerative farming practices, permaculture, small scale farms that recycle, carbon and topsoil. But what that effectively is a recreation of Native American practices, the same types of practices that were here for tens of thousands of years. It's not always acknowledged that way. The leadership in the regenerative movement isn't Native American or, from peasant farming traditions. But this idea of local food is pushing more and more and more to like hyper local. Like, what did the area around Laguna provide to the people this time of year? And like, let's only eat that and not blueberries from Chile or New Zealand.
No, absolutely. I mean, am I going to revert to a Chumash diet entirely? No, but you bring up a good point. Is that there was thoughtful. They were just mindful about what they planted, when they planted, how they planted it.
And
Before
it's a whole
I have to
philosophy
let you
too.
go, but I want to ask, what's that?
I was going to say it's a
I'm
whole
sorry.
philosophy of stewardship of the environment. And of course, in Southern
Hmm.
California and in California in general, there's been just devastation from fire. And people are beginning to realize it's because human beings didn't manage nature. We treated nature as though she was a zoo or a museum. And we didn't do the same types of things that Native Californians did for thousands of years to maintain the health of the environment.
So before I let you go, the question I wanted to ask you is, and I ask this of all filmmakers. It's when people see this film, what are you hoping that they what their immediate takeaway or something that they're going to hold on to after they see your film?
Great question. Number one, it's that Indigenous people are still here, even though most of us didn't learn about Indigenous people in school. They're still here. Their communities are still here. They've kept a lot of traditional knowledge safe. And if we become better friends and better partners, there's a chance that they can share that knowledge. And it's with that knowledge that I think we'll build a much stronger relationship with the environment, a much safer relationship with the environment, and it'll be in the best interest of all of us and all of our family and all of our descendants.
Well, that is a good one to kind of sit and marinate on. And everyone that's decided to take part in this year's Coast Film Festival, please get your eyes on Gather. It is a film that will definitely leave an indelible mark. Sanjay, thank you so much for taking the time, and I wish you continued success. Stay on your quest, my friend. You're doing great work.
Such an honor, Pat. I'm thrilled to be a part of the festival, even if this year it's virtually. I hope that I can get the chance to meet you guys in person someday soon.
We will see
Thank
you
you.
next year. Fingers crossed.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you. All right.